giver of every breath I breathe, author of all eternity, giver of every perfect thing, to you be the glory.
Hi, I'm Lenny Reagan with the Oak Forest Church of Christ in Goldsboro, North Carolina. I'd like to thank you for taking a few minutes out of your day to consider with us some Bible moments, and we'll be right back. Today our study is going to continue with Matthew chapter 24. We began the study last week by looking at some introductory thoughts about Matthew chapter 24, and today we're going to continue that study. I'm going to try my very best to keep the study around 10 or 15 minutes at the most. I know it's hard to sit down and take that much time to away from your schedule to study, so I'll try to keep it brief. If you haven't seen the introduction to Matthew 24, please take a few minutes to do that. Hopefully it will shed some light on some things that we'll not, of course, discuss in this study. But the chapter begins, Matthew 24, begins with the prediction or the prophecy of the temple's destruction. And then you'll remember that the disciples asked Jesus, what are you talking about? What are the signs? And when will be the end of the age and you're coming? And then the balance of the chapter is spent by Jesus in answering those two questions, or those questions. So what I'd like to do is read the first couple of verses, Matthew chapter 24. Jesus came out of the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another which will not be torn down." Now Jesus had been teaching in the temple complex really ever since Matthew chapter 21. And then after he finished teaching, he left the temple, and this was going to be his final time at the temple before his death. Now, the disciples, of course, as all Jews or most Jews were, loved the temple. I mean, it was an essential part of their lives of every day for the Jews. And I suppose, like most Jews, the disciples never imagined that the time would come when the temple would be destroyed. Now, the temple that Jesus and his disciples were in, and the temple that Jesus is talking about, is actually the third temple to be built on that site, on Mount Moriah. You'll remember that David wanted to build the house of God, but God said he couldn't do it because he was a man of bloody hands. David was a warrior. And we know that Solomon was given the opportunity and the privilege to build the temple, and we can read of that building in the Old Testament. What a beautiful temple it must have been. But we do know that the temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in around 586 BC when the Babylonians came in and destroyed Jerusalem because of the failure of God's people to repent. The northern kingdom, Israel, had been taken captive into Assyrian hands sometime earlier, but the temple was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. After the captivity, the 70 years of exile, it was Cyrus the Great, who was king of Persia, who allowed the Jews to go back home and gave them permission and even helped them in the process of building the temple. So under Zerubbabel, the foundation of the temple was laid. But I guess as people sometimes do, we allow other things to become more important than what God would have us to do. And as a result, the building of the temple stopped for about 20 years. But under the preaching of Haggai and Zechariah, the temple was finished. And even though it was much smaller and not seemingly as glorious as Solomon's temple, it was still the house of God, and it stood for a century or so longer than did Solomon's temple. Now, the temple to which Jesus references in Matthew chapter 24:1 is the third temple that was built, and it was built by Herod the Great, and it began in the neighborhood of 19 BC, and the work on the temple was finished on the main part in just a few years, but Herod kept adding to the temple. It was continually being added to or restored, and even during the time of Christ, during the life of Christ, work was going on in the temple, and it was finished about 64 AD, and then of course you'll remember and know that in AD 70 Rome came in and destroyed the temple and Jerusalem as well. But this temple that Herod built must have been a spectacular, beautiful building. I'd like to take just a moment to read something that Josephus wrote. So if you'll bear with me. Now the outward face of the temple in its front wanted nothing that was likely to surprise either men's minds or their eyes, for it was all covered over with the plates of gold of great weight, and at the first rising of the sun reflected back a very fiery splendor, and made those who forced themselves to look upon it to turn their eyes away, just as they would have done at the sun's own rays. But this temple appeared to strangers when they were at a distance like a mountain covered with snow. For as to those parts of it that were not gilt, they were exceeding white. So it really must have been a beautiful building, something to be amazed at. And obviously the disciples were, and all Jews were, amazed at the splendor and the beauty of the temple. Well, when Jesus was approached by the disciples and said, they pointed out to him all the beautiful buildings of the temple and the additions and everything. Jesus, in response to their amazement, he said to them in verse 2, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another which will not be torn down. Well, obviously you can tell that something very catastrophic and traumatic is going to take place that will actually the language indicates or suggests that whatever it is that's going to take place will actually reverse the building process. It's going to be taken down stone by stone. Now, we know by history that there were still and still are parts of the temple that are left. For example, what is called the Wailing Wall is still available today for Jews. And it was a part of that Herod's temple, but we know that what Jesus is talking about is the end of Judaism. Because of their sin, because of their refusal to obey God and to serve God, they're going to be judged, and Judaism is going to be brought to its end. Now, Jesus taught that it was a punishment for sin, and there are going to be prophets who spoke of the destruction of the temple. For example, Jeremiah chapter 7 and Micah chapter 3, and even Jews understood that the destruction of Jerusalem was a judgment from God. Now, it brings us to verse 3, and we're going to briefly touch upon that because our time is short. Verse 3, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Well, the scene now changes from the temple to the Mount of Olives on the east side of Jerusalem. Now, Mark, in writing to Romans, Gentiles, in Mark chapter 13, tells us that the Mount of Olives was opposite the temple. So from the vantage point that Jesus and his disciples had, they were able to see the complete panoramic view of the temple and literally the whole city. And Mark specified that it was Peter, James, John, and Andrew that came to Jesus. Now Matthew says that the disciples came to it privately. Mark tells us that it was Peter, Andrew, James, and John who came. And these men, these four men, asked Jesus the question about his prophecy of the temple and its destruction. And reading the text, it looks as if they're asking three questions. Question number one, tell us, when will these things happen? Question number two, and what will be the sign of your coming? And question number three, and of the end of the age. But actually, it's only two questions. And those two questions are, when will these things happen? Referencing when will the temple be destroyed? When will each stone be torn down? And the second question is, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And those are not two separate questions. In the Jewish mind, the coming of the Lord, the sign of his coming, and the end of the age, in their mind would be the same thing. They're only asking two questions. So, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of your age is just one question. In fact, they are joined grammatically in the Greek text, and they're governed by the same conjunction. Now, the Greek term that's used for coming is a word that refers to one's arrival in the initial or first stage of presence. But it also had some other meanings as well. It would be the appearance of someone, say like a king or an emperor visiting a province. It's the idea of someone who's not seen making an appearance. Both of those definitions actually are fulfilled in Christ's second coming. What I mean by that is this. He is, of course, the divine Son of God, as well as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And although he's hidden, in a sense, at the right hand of God, he's going to reveal himself when he comes again to all humanity, and he's going to display his power in judgment. Part of the misunderstanding that surrounds Matthew chapter 24 is a failure to understand the difference between the two questions that are asked. Those two questions are simply this: when will these things happen? When will the destruction of the temple take place? The second question that they ask, what are the signs of your coming and of the end of the age? That's one question. That's one question. And when we understand that and we begin to see what Jesus actually taught in the balance in the rest of Matthew chapter 24, it helps us quite a bit to understand what's taking place and what the signs are actually pointing to and what they're not pointing to. Well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate your study, and as always, feel free to go to our website, www.oakforestcoc.church, and you can email any questions or comments that you might have. And we'd love to have you join us if you're in the Goldsboro area at any of our services. Again, thank you so much for your time. God bless you. We love you. And Merry Christmas.
Giver of every breath I breathe, author of all eternity, giver of every perfect thing, to you be the glory.